The fourth day is not all that exciting for me, but it may be for you. We get, you know, the idea of the supreme fiction here as well. And there are these ontological questions like, what is pagan? That's a dangerous question, but we get some answers down on bottom of page 61. I think that pagans are artists. That is, they can move from one game to another, and in each of these games, in the optimal situation, they try to figure out new moves. And even better, they try to invent new games. What we call an artist in the usual sense of the term is someone who, in relation to a given purport, the purport of the canvas and the medium of the picta, P-I-C-T-A, for example, proposes new rules of the painting game. Same thing for the so-called independent cinema or for music. Then on page 62, he gives him into what we have been called the tech war, you know, the games that require us to invent the rules, the criteria of playing the games as we go along. But there's talk here about Parmenides and Freud. When Parmenides begins to reflect upon being, he does introduce a new language game. I am deliberately simplifying, that had not been played until then. You know, okay. A very complicated game, a very refined one, very difficult and apparently most amusing. There. Same thing for Freud. We're getting back to proper names. Each one of them is a name born by a game. And it is the artists that always establish the rules of a language game that did not exist before. That is how there is paganism. A sign that people are not pagan, as they should be, is that they believe in the signified of what they are saying, that they stick to the signified, and that they think that they are in the truth. This is where paganism stops, and where something like doctrine, let us say, gets back in. In other words, if just gaming is referred to as just naming, then you're getting back to doctrine, to one person, you. So there is a game of just naming. If you stop to think of the age of Joe, you know, the age of Jane, and so on, whatever the famous names are, okay. Naming an entire period of time, chunk of time, by one person's, who was so great that he or she shaped, okay, the time. So, okay, that would be an oversimplification. And it's a lie, and whether or not it's productive is the question. Okay. But you know, at that point, he says it's moving towards doctrine.
Victor,
Mm-hmm.
This might be a good spot, at least for me. I was seeing connection with what Natasha was saying, this notion of the postmodern condition or the postmodern art, and this notion of making the games before those games exist, or making the rules, I mean, that representing the unrepresentable. And then just naming, I think of the notion of the future anterior as well, what will have been, that at the point that the just naming takes place, that's what this, when that thing that was postmodern or was unrepresentable then becomes representable eventually, right? Is this, can we make these connections?
Sure. The postmodernism is greatly linked up with the notion of the future anterior, okay? What will have been. There's a complete turnaround in terms of past, present, future. What does Heidegger talk about in terms of time? The past is in the future. What? That's crazy. The past is in the future. What? What could that possibly mean? How would you interpret that?
One can only think of the past from the future? From a future in relation to the past?
The only way we can understand the past is coming to us from the future. In time, we will have a particular view, and then another view, and then another view. But there's something else being said here. I'm sorry.
Isn't there a Stustra?
You know?
That we won't know until later on. Look at now. Right?
It's translated in lots of different ways. Nietzsche wrote something, I don't know the German, but it was translated as untimely meditations, in which there is a community coming to us from the future. People are projecting what the future is, and it will have an effect on what the future will be for us. Okay, that's one way to explain it. That's almost messianic. Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to go that far for Nietzsche, but it's called untimely. Is the German word. Again, I don't know the German word, and it gets interpreted this way. When Arrowsmith, a classicist, translates it, he says, unmodern meditations. Unmodern. Modernity never occurred. Okay? And there's an attempt to get that across to people. Nietzsche is saying it didn't happen. Forget it. He's working on it at the very beginning of the scandalous piece of The Birth of Tragedy. And then had to write a second later, or, back off from his own, okay? But then begin to get it the way that it needed to be. The time we are living in, if there's hope, it's being shaped by those who are projecting a time that is outside of time, outside of what we generally think of time as chronological. Nietzsche is very specific about it in the first essay. What is the use and abuse of history or something like that. And what's really interesting is that in the first translations of untimely meditations, the fifth essay was not included, which was entitled We Philologists, in which he's just taking on philology and why it's not life-furthering and life-sustaining. So that's what he asks, is this life-furthering and life-sustaining? Or is this a sickness? In Zarathustra, you find out about the past really early. And what is the past? It's referred to as it was. And it was not good. And I'm very unhappy about it. And I'm going to wreak havoc in getting revenge. And so then Nietzsche begins to talk about affirmative forgiving and forgiving. Did you talk about that in the Hermeneutics? But Nietzsche talks about that there is a good forgetting. There are things that we must affirm and forget. Just let them go. It's not a willing, it's just that they're not there anymore. They're not important. So that's why a lot of people talk about Nietzsche as being a psychologist of Europe or the continent, because of these illnesses. And he kept saying, well, this is going to get bad. It's coming. Yeah, he was appropriate. His sister didn't help, and we're not going to blame her. Yes?
To come back to the statement of Heidegger's, the past is in the future, is this with the Greek inception? And
it's Greek.
And it's our sort of, in a sense, failure yet to have become its subjects.
That's right.
And
when excuse me, before I forget, Bernard Knox, K-N-O-X, has written about this.
okay.
And there are particular people like Tiresias, Oedipus, and others, who back up into the future, is the phrase that is used. The translation from the Greek, and I don't know the Greek. So there is a sense of the past being in the future. A deep sense of that among the Greeks. I mean, we're not the Greeks, you know, but, and it's very hard for us to even begin to understand what they were saying.
So, what did we do then with, since you brought him up, with Heidegger from a Lyotardian perspective? I mean, what do we do with, I guess what's hard for me, and perhaps I'm just not a subtle enough reader of it, but hard for me not to read is an absolute obsession with the origins.
Well, as long as there are all these other origins, variants, right? He talks about the past and the future in the Parmenides seminar. It's up front, the opening pages. It's brilliant. It is on Anaximander as well. But he just calls it the Parmenides seminar. It is incredible book. I have students read it, first year students read it. Because it tells them that history does not have to be written chronologically. And it gives them a completely different view of Parmenides. It's completely different. A lot of philologists don't like Heidegger. They set the Nazi thing aside and just simply say, his philology is terrible. It just doesn't work. This is not following their rules. Other thoughts? I'm sorry I haven't paid attention to you. Other thoughts over here? And then the fifth day. This is where he starts talking about hesitating. And for some people, hesitating is not good. You need to be firm. You need to make a decision. Okay? But he's strung out between the sophists and Kant. And why resolve it? That's the act of modernity, not being able to resolve it. Because of the parallax. Did I talk about this before? The parallax view. You know, you do. Okay, so I can point right at you right there. Okay? And I can see you there, and I do this. Uh-oh. Now I'm pointing at Mary. Okay. So where are you? And in the 19th century, there's a lot of time spent on this. They're aware of it. Melville is aware of it. Did I talk about that before? Melville? The big film, the big novel about seeing the world, okay, and describing it is Moby Dick. And basically what Melville decides, he's got two whales, right? One on the right side, one on the left, roped to the ship. And one is called Kant, and one is called Locke. Okay, obviously, very different. So there you go, decide look on. Because if he cuts one off, what's going to happen? The ship's going to go like this. So what he is saying is we have to live with that paradox. Because when we choose one, we damage everything. And then he goes on later, and the object that is being looked at is the whale, Moby Dick, okay? The white whale. And everyone sees it differently, okay? It's all about seeing the world, vision. It's a visual thing. And then there are passages in there where Melville, who's the person who survives at the very beginning, Ishmael, says, humankind, model thyself after the whale. Because the whale does not have a unified vision to fool it. Just eye over here and eye over here. And the whale can live way down at the bottom of the ocean and way up at the top. It can live in all those environments and survive. And therefore, if we want to survive as a species and not be Ahab, or whoever else. And then we have to be able to live with these contraries. But he studies this one in the book. The whole encyclopedia passages that he writes, all this information about the whales. To understand them. Okay? Well, you could do it with anything. You could do it with termites. The story of foundations in Rome is the 7 hills of Rome. And over centuries and centuries and centuries, Sarah says, termites go and they pick up little bits and they go miles and drop them and they make 7 hills of Rome. The foundation of Rome from termites. You've got to love it. And they're patient. These termites, that's what they're doing for, their full life. And then the generation after generation after generation, they build. But we think of termites as what? Destructive. Tearing down foundations. So tearing down the foundations over here and building a new foundation too. So you get these figures, these little anecdotes like that, and they're incredibly powerful. Because they stick with you. So there's a good reason to go to literature, especially particular people, and read, because you get explanations that stick with you and complement, complete what's going on in these books.
Joyce also had really interesting ideas on. He was really fascinated in parallax view and.
Who? I'm sorry.
James Joyce.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And Ulysses, he was really playing a lot with that and some of his early things too. But that was the main reason that he had all of these characters coming in, trying to give an alternate view of the same thing.
Exactly. And look at Finnegan's Wake again. It's on the structuralist, cross of paradigm. I mean, what is it? Diachronic and what is it? Paradigmatic, syntagmatic. They're all going on simultaneously. You get those. You get this. Okay. All speaking simultaneously. How we can manage that? What was I going to say? There's a book you might want to read by Caratani. And he talks about the parallax view, and then Zizek read this book and wrote the book, The Parallax View. The title of his book is Trans something. What is it?
Trans critique.
Trans critique. And he deals with Kant and with Marx. And what he demonstrates in going through it is they get caught in this parallax view, and they can't. And they continue to thrive as thinkers and writers as long as they don't resolve it. Freud clearly is caught up in it, and he can't. And there are people who are rotten with perfection, who want it resolved and want the truth of the matter. Well, that's not the truth. What you want, what you're going to end up with will not be the truth of it. Okay. But the cover design for Zizek's book, have you seen it? I mean, it's an example of the parallax view. So, what is it? He's sitting in a chair and there's a mirror or something? What is it?
I think it's an empty chair.
It's right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not.
Oh, okay. No, I got the book here.
And then he's got, I don't understand him. He's such a psycho case. Then he's got all this stuff in there about Derrida and Deleuze. Do you know what I'm talking about? Some of the things he's saying? I wouldn't repeat them here. And I'm a pagan. Okay, what else? Here's an interesting thing. Further elaboration of the difference between language as a spoken game and language as a listening game. I want you to think about gaming and all that's going on. Serious gaming, across the country, in the U.S. and the continent, and in Japan and China and so on. All of the gaming is going on. And kids are learning, their brains are being rewired to think along those lines. And whereas there used to be writing across the curriculum, and communications across the curriculum, which was both speech and could be videos or whatever. Now there's going to be gaming across the curriculum and the making of games. I mean, not that you would go somewhere. I mean, you could do this and get get an undergraduate degree in game design or whatever. Okay, but I mean, kids are in an English course or English communication studies. Course taught by 3 different departments, okay? They're making games, very primitive, early forms of games. And all they need is the engine, which is already built, and then they've got their games. They can make their own games. So what I'm trying to say is the technology is there. It's not just cards, okay? Now it's electronic. Okay, when I say transcendence, this is on page 71 down at the bottom. I take over a term used by Levinas and also by Kant, when the latter says that which obligates is something absolutely beyond our intelligence. In terms of language games, it must be granted that to understand what a prescription and an obligation is, the pole of the sender must be neutralized. Okay, so in terms of communications triangle. This has to be wiped out. The center has to be wiped out. How do you do that? Okay. Because you're getting a message, but you don't know where the message is coming from. So you're going to call it God, the messenger God. Or you will actually have a messenger. An angel will come. A God will send an angel or somebody to announce what has happened. Okay. And so the emphasis, however, is here in listening, which can be seen as very passive. Remember, that's discussed in the book. Okay. And what you want is an active listener. But no, the passive means a radical passivity. It's a third term. There is active, there is passive, and then there's radical passivity. There's a book on this, Radical Passivity, by Wall, I think it's W-A-L-L. That's the title, Radical Passivity. Discusses Levinas, Abandonment, and a couple of other people. My show, I think. It's very, very interesting. These third terms are really, they're not very elegant. It's like negative, positive, non-positive, affirmative. But it's a cumbersome expression. Blanchot coined it, as far as I know, and Foucault picked it up and started passing it around. But, so, Parmenides is here. I am the authority, okay, and I am telling you this new game. Okay? And it's really not a game, it's the truth of the matter. Okay? It's how he gets interpreted. But you look at the Heideggerian thing, and no, it's really something over here. Listening. Conceiving and conceiving. Conceiving and conceiving. So it's hearing, but it's seeing as well. So, and this is the Moses game.
None of this is transcendental. We might think of this as transcendental. Usually what happens is that if we're working with the notion of immanence, that it is within us, okay? Or we're working with the other word immanence with a spell with an I and not an A, where there is at any point in time, unexpectedly, something can happen, you know, an event of some kind, okay? Which is different, okay? But immanence, speaking of immanence with an A, you know, Jean-Luc Nancy reminds us and wants us to be very careful because it can easily fall back into transcendence. And then you're going to have a superficial economy of some kind. So there are two things going on here. There's the Moses game and the pagan game. So in a sense, you're getting rid of the possibility of a God. The God. Transcendentalism. Okay? I mean, this would be the logical move, okay? The paralogical move. That then, you know, there are polygods, many gods. And they don't know any more than the other gods know. They have their stories that we don't have. Okay? So we read that passage. But what is the message here? You can do this with Lacan, the imaginary, the symbolic, the little object autre, and here would be the real, which is suppressed, but which manifests itself nonetheless. The real is what the symbolic cannot represent. It's the excess of the symbolic. So this scheme has been used over and over again to try to explain these events. And this right here is constantly changing. It's very protean for this. And possibly for this. And the interpretation of Heidegger, I mean Heidegger's interpretation of Parmenides, let me say this again, which really sort of belongs over here, where I don't know, would have to create, maybe it belongs here, would be a messy reality as well. You never get to see the one that gives you that. And therefore the question is always open, and you're always questioning, but you're not answering or falling into any definitive answer to the question that's there. So one constantly lives with the question. But then when Lyotard wrote his book about Heidegger and the Jews, what did he say? Heidegger showed a contempt for being. He answered the question. About the Jews. Such a game, 72, is the game of the just. And in this game, one speaks only in as much as one listens. That is, one speaks as a listener and not as an author. It is a game without an author. In the same way as the speculative game of the West, in ontology, is a game without a listener. Because the only listener tolerated by the speculative philosopher is the disciple. Oh man, that's a hit. Well, what is a disciple? Someone who can become an author, who will be able to take the master's place. So this raises the biggest question about how do you teach? I mean, it's a psychoanalytic moment. You cannot learn anything. I cannot learn anything if I'm not in transference with somebody who's the so-called teacher. Okay. Let's put that in brackets, but the person who's talking. I cannot, if there is not transference there, and then it gets into counter-transference and so on. But how do you extricate yourself from being a potential disciple? How do you do that? It hasn't been written about enough. No one knows. You just sort of live through it. The only person I know who really talks about it at length is René Girard, where similarity causes violence, not difference. And violence, we usually think of violence comes about because of differences. You're not, it's them and us. We need a goat, so we're going to barbecue them. Okay. but there is violence of similarity as well. Where do you go? Okay. Of similarity as well. The very idea of twins being born in a certain culture at a certain time is like a monster. You have to get rid of it. Well, what is a disciple? Someone who can become an author who will be able to take the master's place. This is the only person to whom the master speaks. This is a pragmatic privilege. It sets the limits of a language game. So you see that all language games have rules, and these rules deal with the functioning of the various pragmatic positions. What you had just said about the prescriptive game shows that one of its basic rules is indeed that the position of the sender must remain empty. No one may put herself or himself there. No one may be the authority. Then JFL says it after Tibble. Transcendence is imminent to the prescriptive game. This must be understood. What is being called the transcendence of the prescriptive is simply the fact that the position of the sender, is simply the fact that the position of the sender as authority that obligates is left vacant. That is, the prescriptive utterance comes from nothing. Its pragmatic virtue of obligation results from neither its content nor its utterer. So it's the double negation, or it's better to put it this way, the denegation of the sender. For there to be a sender, there would be a subject, right? And that's always a presence of negation. Okay, you have to be under the sign of negation to be a subject. And so it's doing away with it altogether. And so then, let me ask you this, mathematically, what are the possible permutations and combinations of this triangle? You're really only dealing with these two. And then you don't want to deal with this at all, because it's a problem. So how many variations can you have on this? We would hope in the infinite number. And in the pagan game, there are infinite possibilities. If you take the logic of compossibility, you get out of the negative. The ideal, the actual, and the possible. Those are the three that Aristotle talks about. The ideal, the actual, and the possible. And they're all under the sign of negation. But compossible, once it's liberated from Leibniz, the one God, okay, then everything is possible there. So there's the creation of the notion of compossibility. The same thing with geometry. Did I talk about that? Well, Euclidean geometry was it, or right angle was 45 degrees, right? Well, maybe 90 degrees. Well, you know, we can do it. And then there are like roughly 7 or 6 or whatever statements, propositions about Euclidean geometry. But the last 2, as the story goes, were not elegant sentences. They were sentences that any, obsessive person would want to rewrite. And so one of the sentences was rewritten in such a way that it gave us a totally different geometry. It was an elliptical geometry. And the other sentence was rewritten in such a way that it gave us another geometry, hyperbolic geometry. This was a scandal. This was a scandal. Well, which one is right? Oh, how do you determine that? So they ran, according to Perlman, they conducted these experiments with like 3, mountains in the Alps. But their baseline was Euclidean geometry. Well, that's a different read. You can't do that. And so many years later, I remember hearing people at NASA saying, you know, to be able to get to the moon, we had to use 2 or 3 different geometries. So you don't pick one over the other unless you need it. Okay. So what does that say about space? Is it Euclidean? Probably not. I mean, most people who think about space, the cosmos, think of it in many different geometries. Is it flat? You know, when we go through the Mobius strip for the libidinal economy, he starts out with a Mobius strip and space is curved there, okay? And very generative, okay? It generates so much. We should bring some drums next time. Can one engage in a politics without finality? When is a politics finally a good politics and we can live together? Never. On page 77, you begin, he doesn't use the expression disilogoi, but he uses the notion of counter-examples. If they, okay, whatever the stories might be, are opinions, they are reversible. They admit counter-examples, like all opinions, and so on. Interesting thing. Have you read at all in the philosophy of science? Karl Popper, Michael Polanyi, Paul Feyerabend. Looking at, what is it that Karl Popper says? You can never prove anything to be true. So what we're going to do is use the principle of falsification. We will continue to use something until we find that it doesn't work. And it's no longer true for that event. Okay, so we can prove something to be false. We can never prove it to be true. Polanyi really clouds the issue about knowledge, because he says at first all knowledge is incarnate. That is, it's in the body. And only a certain percentage of that knowledge gives up here in the cerebral cortex, which is where we think of as knowledge, yes. There's the knowledge of the body. I mean, if you play piano, do you stop and think, you know, where you're going to put down every finger, or you type, you know, and so on. You know how to balance yourself. You feel that someone's looking at you from the back. You have gut feelings. The intellect will say, this is it, this is really cool, you should do this. And your guts are going, oh my God, no, don't do this. Okay. There are all kinds of examples like that. There are, one of his primary examples is experts, doctors in reading x-rays. An x-ray that has this, like this, it's two broken bones. We can see it. Okay. Very simple. But in looking at x-rays of bodies with beginning cancer, there's nothing to point to. There's nothing in the x-rays to point to. The doctor just begins to talk about it. And those interns who follow him, or, you know, doctors who were interns 20 years ago follow, you know, to keep learning, get a sense of how he's looking at something and talking about it, and moving with his body and so on. You hear someone walking down the hall, and you know who it is. Well, you say, well, you know, it's got a shuffle, but, you know, how can you pick? You pick up the phone and you know who it is. How do you know
So, knowledge is incarnate to begin with, and we need to take that into consideration when we talk about knowledge. Paul Feyerabend, unbelievable. Built himself as an epistemological anarchist. And he basically talked about science as a series of games. And he said the sophists were the great scientists. And he says anybody who's an expert dives deep and sees nothing. And what he's really saying is, in the first edition, there are 4 editions, and they're all, the title is Against Method. That sounds like contra to no. Against means alongside method.
The name of the author again?
Feyerabend, F-E-Y-E-R-A-B-E-N-D. F-E-Y-E-R. A-B-E-N-D. And it's a book you have to read. And in the first edition, one of his students, grad students, made the index for him. And under R was Rhetoric, pages 1 to 356. And the sophists again he's a champion of the sophists because he says that they're willing to try to keep all the arguments afloat. Okay? Not picking one. Even the most contrary ones. Okay? Trying to catch them. And throwing them back up. The motion of the whole. And he says it's after the fact that scientists try to make their solution to a problem or their invention or their insight or whatever, they try to make it look rational. When in fact it's not. But he's someone you need to read. And in the third edition, he gives his curriculum vitae at the back of the book. And how did he start out? What was his discipline? Drama. Hamming it up. Drama. So let's say he started with Aristotle's Poetics and rewrote it. Okay. So that was his beginning. And he stuck with it. Even though he changed. Each edition, usually it just comes out, new edition, and you have to, buy the next edition, okay? And each one is totally rewritten. And the fourth was published posthumously with a whole series of introductions by many, many people. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that philosophers, of science do not make science this logical project, that there are all these other things that are going on. Okay? And the question of really knowing the truth of something is up in the air. Okay? You can think so, but no.
If I can add to that, one of the best parts of that book is that he calls Galileo's astronomy doesn't progress until he becomes a propagandist.
Mm-hmm.
He says he's a better propagandist than he was a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And not until after the fact you can go back and explain everything. But
You tell the story well, and the Gestalt switch turns, and people see it. And remember, it has to be abstract so that people can fool around with it. Okay, not have it too clear and definitive. It's got to give people pleasure. Or they're not going to go with it. Pleasure and pain. What do we add pain? Giving Kant. And then it has to change. The issue is not that they're poo-pooing the truth with a capital T. The issue is how they do this, how they think. Okay. And the issue is, how is this life-furthering and life-sustaining, politically, ethically, and in every other way? Those are the issues. It's not trying to be the bad boy and say there's no truth. God's dead. Come on. he's talking about pure techne on page 78. That's something you definitely want to take a look at. Techne, T-E-C-K-N-E, it's spelled here T-E-K-H-N-E. It gets translated in many different ways. In Aristotle, when he defines rhetoric, at least in this one translation, rhetoric is the art, the techne, okay, of discovering the available means of persuasion in the given case. There's nothing universal in the given case. Okay. That's what courts do. They decide in an individual case. And they build up a case history, which goes along with the laws, okay, how judges have determined particular cases. But then that gets retranslated, okay, as rhetoric is the dunamis, the potentiality of seeing the available needs of persuasion. Or it's translated this way. Let us think that rhetoric is. Because we're not working from a book that he published. No university press, University of Greece didn't publish his books. They were notes. And, he's talking about rhetoric maybe for the first time, And so he says, let us, hypothetically think of rhetoric as being this, and then it's techne. Now, the problem with the word techne is it sounds like technology. And so then you get what is referred to as the Victorian lens, and you miss everything that's going on. There's something within human beings. They have the capability, the potentiality to see how to change people's minds or change things around. In the physics, is it? One of the opening lines is, all human beings desire to know. In other words, my Greek friend said, well, has the appetite to know. It's not, we're curious. And so, Judith Butler, I think her dissertation was subjects of desire.
Wow.
Should we do a Dionysian thing? Scandalized looking. So Kant is a sophist on page 78. This pisses off people. And then on page 79, he's talking about the Corax Theseus argument that went before a judge. Whether this happened or not, who cares? Because it illustrates the principle. How does it go? I can't remember. One of them is bigger than the other.
They're both defending clients, theoretically.
Oh, okay.
So the way it goes, they're each defending or clients, but they're also both their own clients.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Corax has taught Theseus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
And Theseus takes Corax to court for repayment to get his money back. He says, "You taught me to be a rhetor, and it was garbage. I want my money back."
And the argument is that one is bigger, and it's only natural to think and draw the conclusion that the bigger person would beat up the other person, the smaller person. Right?
Well,
but the arguments get turned around. This is what's being illustrated here. It gets turned around. Okay. That you would think that, but and the judge just throws the case out of court. Aristotle uses it as an example of the failure. You could argue both sides. Okay. And it's not good. Or a lot of other people have. Yeah, that is the version I was trying to recall. Thanks. What else do you want to say something?
I was this version is different. Like the George Kennedy version is more about the they're different. The judge throws them out of court because essentially says you deserve each other.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently they were potentially the same person, that there was no two people, that there was just.
Well, it's to illustrate that the arguments can be turned around, right?
Yeah.
That every argument is imminently reversible. And you better be aware of that. And both sides can be very compelling. When you realize that and live through it, it can be frightening, it can be devastating. And you begin to wonder, am I sane? How is it that both of these things can happen? Be right. And the sophists, whether or not they were aware of that based on their lived experiences, let's do the phenomenology thing or not, I don't know, okay? But they taught people, for good or for bad, to be able to argue both sides. To go into the court system and argue both sides. Some of them did. Whereas Gargius was more philosophically minded in terms of language. And his view of language is very different. I mean, it's chironic. Okay, there is this reading by Untersteiner, the Italian philosopher, who no one likes because he's following Nietzsche and Heidegger. Talks about Gorgias's piece in Encomium of Helen. Okay,
Who's this?
arguing the general argument is that she didn't make a decision. He's defending Helen. It was not her. She was abducted by language, by the Logos.
Which Italian philosopher?
Understand. And his argument is somewhat the same, okay, and it goes like this, that the chironic explosion was, she was caught up, these are imaginary surveys, and that's all we can do. And was there a trauma, was there a Helen? Helen is a topoi, a set of topoi, stories to tell. To say bad things about women, they're the cause of all the face that 1,000 ships, she launched 1,000 ships, and all those men died because of her, Paris, well, he's just a young guy in hormones, But what he says, Untersteiner says, is that she was caught up in an either or. I'm going to go, oh no, I can't go, I'm going to go, no, I can't go. And immediately Kairos kicks in, that part of logic that just pushes her into a direction. But what's insidious and invidious about that topos of Helen is, no matter what, she gets raped or abducted. The word abduction for the Sabine women is abduction, okay, but it still falls under the general category of rape. But in ancient times, did they have an idea of rape? Classicists don't know. And some of them are saying, well, they had no idea of rape, so it wasn't rape. But the problem is, we read these stories, and it has an effect on us today. Okay. What else, folks? We have 10 minutes for the rest of the day. So on page 80, he's still talking about reverse argumentations. And it has to do with, again, the scale, the golden mean. How do you adjust it? How do you serve it? How do you make sure that both sides are getting the remedy in a just, proportional manner? So on the last pages of the fifth day, they're talking about the scales. They're talking about he's talking about the paradox of the scales of justice, and they're searching for a tear. And then well into the sixth day, it's talking about intuitions and concepts and so on. And he asks the question, why Kant, on page 84? Is it? Yeah, it's on page, actually, 85. And so, down at the bottom. JFL says, we get back here to this distinction for which Kant has been irreplaceable, to me at least. That is the distinction between prescriptives and denotatives. So he goes into this explanation of why is he picking up Kant? Why did he choose Kant? You can read the rest of that. And then he gets into, Lyotard does, via Tyrrell, talking about the writing of the fourth critique. The fourth critique. Everyone is writing the fourth critique, the fifth critique. But why critique? Why does one use critique? The technique of critique, to make the world a better place. Right? So what kind of critique are we talking about? I do not want you to accept what I said blindly about the entire Frankfurt School, okay? Just dismissing them, okay? They're not dismissed. They have to stay there. But reason does not resolve these issues. And so there must be another economy. And we're going to read that libidinal economy all day tomorrow, okay? And I'll show you some examples. And we have, the scene from the Herzog film. No, we have Lauren Kipnis's Marx poem, a video. Have you seen this? God, it's so campy. It's old, okay? There is a chorus in it, it's drag queens, and they just sort of pop in and they comment on what's going on in the story and so on. But it's Laura Kipnis's critique of Marx. Not taking the body into consideration, libido and so on. What else is on your mind?
Could we maybe address the problem of terrorism?
Oh, I hear this one. Thank you. I want you to take a look at this one. I can probably have time to spend with it.
I think it's on page like 70 something. Even before me.
It's fourth day, I think.
But I have problems with understanding his position.
74.
Oh, yeah.
74.
But they all partake in a similar attitude toward what one would call rational terrorism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where on the people?
67, it's
Yeah.
where it starts. All the problem of terrorism.
What is being called terrorism is something that actually includes two types of operations. There is a type of violence that at bottom belongs to the game of war. So he's thinking in terms of games. I am in front of an adversary. I make a breakthrough, an incursion. I destroy a part of his forces. I do not see what is objectionable about that. When the group Red Army Fraction makes an incursion and destroys the American computer in Heidelberg, that is war. The group considers itself at war. It is waging war, and it is actually destroying a part of the forces of the adversary. Very good. That is part of the rather exact game. That is a two-sided war. But when the same group kidnaps, how do you pronounce his name, Schleyer, and blackmails a third party with Schleyer's death as the stake, then we are in an altogether different violence that has no relation to the previous one, and which alone, in my view, deserves the name of terrorism, and so on. Jumping down to the bottom, the taking of hostages is something else. It is the death of another person, a threat of death, that is used as an argument. It is pedagogical politics. We will make you aware of the collusion between Schleyer and the state's police terror. That looks pedagogical, but cannot really be. It is a politics in which the real aim is to force the third party to yield. And the third party is not just the state, of which one makes oneself the threatening teacher. It is public opinion. It's pedagogical politics, in other words, the taking of hostages.
one invites the second. Now, that's not developed fully enough, to really understand all the ins and outs of this. But a lot of terrorism has been the capture of someone and then the pedagogy, the teaching of that person. And broadcasting it so that everyone else is taught as well. Okay? But finally, the person is not let go, the person is killed.
Well, the teaching of everyone else, right? By taking that person, so that there's, if you kidnap Schla, there because he's a bad guy, then you're on the same territory. And he makes the whole point about this. I can't remember if it's here or in the different, but I think it's here. Right? He goes into depth about how if you kidnap Schla, he's expecting you to do something. He's got his bodyguards. He experiences. There's no different in a sense because you're on the same. You, Red Army faction, and he, Schla, are submitting to the same adjudication, which is an adjudication by force of some sort. But the public, who you're educating by snatching him and executing him or not executing him or whatever, threatening to execute him and eventually executing him, isn't actually essentially playing that particular language game. It's not in that phrase universe. It's supposed to learn something via that in an entirely different phrase universe. So the public opinion is supposed to be formed by an armed conflict that presupposes that the existence of a state of war that's not sort of accepted already by public opinion as a state of war, and so would then be asserting its own particular sort of judicial force, for lack of a better word there, in a way that insists that the public be then educated to what? Educated to this particular way of viewing things, but done so in a way in which the public there's no possibility of engagement with anybody who doesn't already see things that way. In fact, does that seem fair?
Yeah, it's not going to. It's bad faith. It's not going to teach anyone anything. So that is a really big open question about terrorism, because it's a book or many books in itself.
But I was really thinking, I mean, I read this part again, and I was really thinking on all of Lyotard's position that could very easily be turned into terrorism, not in such an evident way, but the way the guerrillas act in Latin America, for example, could very easily be could be regardless of what they do, if it's good or bad. I'm not judging right now, but it could be incorporated into his logic where there are no laws. The laws are being made, but they're made against a group. I mean, who knows? Maybe there's a problem there that I can't figure it out. I don't even have the language. In other words, could those people? I'm not talking about the really horrible terrorism, which is evidently clear, but there are a lot of actions of guerrilla groups, at least in various countries and in different moments, that we're not just attacking others. They're infiltrating themselves with other logics and sometimes with a lot of creativity, with very ingeniously, to break the laws and start new ways. And that's where can you put a dividing point so that what he's helping us see as other ways of not beginning with one God, with not one narrative, but when there are multiple narratives, and you have to work against a group where it thinks it's a God. The only way is to shatter that God. I mean, I'm just not understanding.
Well, there's not enough here for us to work with, but what I would say is, and not with
a lot of assurance, self-assurance, is that there are two games. There's the game of war
Yeah, that's
and to win.
that's very
But
clear.
the other games are to keep the game going.
Yeah.
Now, you have Sam Weber's, essay at the end, so you need to read that and
But
see
it's
his
like-
take on it as well. And there is the Nietzschean notion of Homer's contest, in which one person cannot win all the time. The person has to be blackballed, thrown out.
Yeah, but I was thinking the tech game, the tech game is, if you keep the game going and if it is quotation marks interesting enough or creative enough, it's okay. But if it isn't, then how do we know when it is being creative and not just being destroyed or whatever? That my point is where are those limits? Because if we put limits again, then the whole game is destroyed and we're going back to certain rules.
It's an impossible game. It's this. You ask everybody, do you feel that this is a just game for you? It goes to that extreme. I mean, you can take it to that extreme to test it. And if you find one person whom generally, you think is sane or whatever, okay, I just throw that in. I don't know that that's the case, okay. Then, or you get a certain percentage, like 95% who think it's just. But that's the question, is this just? And you have to leave open, the possibility of other people disagreeing. And try to find some way to create a remedy for them as well. So it's unending. It's totally unending. You never know.
Yeah.
But the alternative is catastrophic. How many million dead? Okay, thank you.